As night falls and the world outside gradually quiets down, we are about to embark on a journey where history is not merely recounted, but revived. Tonight, you will see why the Middle Ages are not only famous for armored knights or crumbling castles, but also for bizarre stories so strange that even today, the modern world must take notice. Before diving into these peculiar secrets, if you enjoy fresh perspectives on history and want to accompany me on future explorations, please hit subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you are watching from. Every interaction of yours is the energy that keeps these stories alive. Now, dim the lights a little, let the sound soften, and prepare your mind, because what we are about to uncover will keep you glued to the screen until the very last moment of the video. If you ever thought that medieval conspiracies were just jokes concocted by bored people in taverns, then get ready to reconsider everything. Because as soon as we delve deeper into that world, you will realize something far more terrifying. Many of the rumors whispered among the people of the Middle Ages turned out to be true in a worrying way. Not partially true, or true in a symbolic sense, but literally true. The kind that makes modern researchers frown and ask, wait, really? And no example illustrates this better than the Knights Templar, a group that transformed from an organization protecting travelers into a collective nightmare for all of Europe. Imagine this. You live in the 13th century, a world where peasants feared winter more than demons, kings feared meals more than rebels, and the church feared anything not created by themselves. In that context, a group of warriors appeared, clad in white, moving with authority, wealthy beyond knowing where to store their gold, and most importantly, refusing to reveal to anyone what they were doing in secret meetings. How could people not become paranoid? You see, conspiracies flourished at times when information was scarce, but imagination was abundant. The problem with the Knights Templar was that imagination didn't need to work hard, because what they did was already enough to fuel rumors. People whispered that they held secret treasures. Kings suspected they controlled half of Europe's economy. Clerics claimed they practiced strange rituals behind stone walls. And the funniest thing is, all of this was partially true. Let's start with the treasure. No one knew exactly where their treasure was, and this only made medieval imagination burn hotter than Smaug's fire. They collected taxes, received offerings, protected pilgrims' property, and held the money of nearly every noble in Europe. In the 13th century, depositing money with the Templars was like putting it in a bank, except that the people guarding your money were armed with sharp swords and religious devotion. Naturally, when an organization suddenly had more gold than any kingdom, people began to suspect they were hiding something. And indeed, they were hiding, mostly because no wise person announces where their treasure is. So people filled the gaps with imagination, and thus legends were born. But treasure was only the tip of the conspiracy iceberg. What truly sent shivers down spines was their organization and discipline. While peasants took months to organize a wedding, the Knights Templar could mobilize an army from France to Syria faster than you could say, Holy War. They had their own intelligence network, their own codes, and a command system that many modern military experts would admire. A disciplined, wealthy, powerful, and secretive group in the Middle Ages. That was equivalent to wearing a sign saying, spread more rumors about us. And the rumors kept multiplying. Some said they worshipped talking heads. Others swore they possessed mystical manuscripts that could control kings. Some thought they wielded power enough to make the Pope respond to their letters immediately. Yet the most remarkable thing was that reality did nothing to ease that fear. Because the closer people looked, the more they realized this organization was indeed somewhat suspicious. But if you think only the Knights Templar made the Middle Ages a paradise for conspiracies, you'd be surprised by what went on inside castles and courts. Behind every wooden door, every mossy stone wall, was a fragile system of power where a small rumor could topple a dynasty. Kings lived in constant fear that those closest to them could betray them. They feared not just swords or arrows, but silver spoons, copper pots, even bread that looked slightly too soft. That's why it's no coincidence that anyone in a high position in the court was obsessed with what we now call food security. In a world where poisoning happened more often than correspondence, Even a normal breakfast could make a king think twice. Modern historians can debate the accuracy of each assassination, but one thing is undeniable. Simply believing that the whole court was trying to kill you was enough to turn royal life into a survival game. What made the Middle Ages special was not that people were paranoid, but that the paranoia often had a basis. And when you live in an era where secret cults existed, monks both transcribing scripture and acting as spies, princes smiling at you today but sending poisoned letters tomorrow, you understand why people treated every bizarre story as a serious warning. Therefore, conspiracies were not just nonsense whispered in the dark. They reflected the anxieties, fears, and insecurities of a world where the line between truth and falsehood was thinner than a monk's robe. And it is precisely that fragility that made the Middle Ages an ideal place for stories that seemed absurd on the surface, but upon closer inspection were chillingly plausible. If you think that witch hunts were just a late phenomenon in the early modern period, then rethink that. Because even in the centuries we often imagine with gentle monks and glittering grain fields, people lived in an atmosphere where anyone who knew too much about herbs instantly became the subject of whispers by the fireside. The issue was not that they were witches, but that they knew things the religious authorities did not: how to heal without opening veins or praying until hoarse. For medieval Europe, that was already too much power for an ordinary woman. And that power, even if only the power of knowledge, sparked one of the most persistent conspiracies of the era: that there was a secret network of women operating like a clandestine medical society under the moonlight. Every time a woman in the village cured a neighbor's child of a fever with a handful of weeds and warm water, people looked at her with a mix of gratitude and fear. Yes, they were truly grateful. But before they could offer thanks, suspicion followed them for life. Yet the irony is that this network, though not a coven of witches, actually existed in the way people feared most. Not a magical society, but a silent system of apprenticeship where midwives, healers, and herbalists passed down knowledge from generation to generation. They had no mystical rituals, but they had secret remedies. They did not gather around boiling cauldrons, but met in houses faintly scented with herbs and kitchen smoke. For the church, that was unsettling enough. In that context, small mistakes, a failed birth, a child with a high fever, or simply a seriously ill peasant who did not survive, became perfect fodder to turn suspicion into accusation. The whole village could adore you today, then the next morning declare you a witch, simply because you knew how to identify a poisonous mushroom they couldn't tell apart. That was the Middle Ages. You were trusted as long as your knowledge did not exceed the imagination of the community. But if the female healers were a kind of unintentional conspiracy, the real organized conspiracies came from the least expected places: guilds, medieval trade unions, and merchant groups who treated trade secrets like heirlooms. For example, there were baker guilds responsible for all the baking in a city, but they also spread rumors that illegal bakers were poisoning the well water, not because they believed it, but because it was a way to maintain monopoly. And it was funny to realize that people actually believed it. There were also goldsmith guilds, possessing metal refining techniques Europe had never seen. When you could turn raw silver into jewelry so bright it made kings suspicious, you suddenly became a suspect in a dozen conspiracies involving alchemy, curses, and dark powers. But in reality, they only had one simple secret: they told no one how they did it. And so conspiracy theories formed on their own, needing no preparation. The peak of this obsession came with stories of the night travelers, a concept modern people might call underground patrols or town agents. These were small groups, often hired by nobles or merchants, tasked with spying, gathering information, and sometimes dealing with troublemakers. Essentially, they were local spies, but with black clothing and the habit of working after dusk. Villagers saw them as hired ghosts sowing fear. Interestingly, these groups did exist, but they were not as mysterious as villagers imagined. They were simply people who knew how to keep silent, analyze situations, and, importantly, repay those who hired them. Of course, that did nothing to lessen the villagers' obsession, who lived in an era where the light of a single candle could make them imagine a ghost. Yet all of that was not the greatest conspiracy. The greatest conspiracy, or at least the one that drove all of Europe crazy, came from the most powerful people, chroniclers. That's right, not wizards, not witches, but those who wrote history. In a world where literacy was as rare as gold, whoever controlled ink and parchment controlled the collective memory of a generation. And this was something ordinary medieval people suspected, a suspicion that seemed trivial but was quite accurate. Chroniclers did not record everything truthfully. They recorded what their patrons wanted. They omitted defeats. They exaggerated victories. They described people they disliked in ways that made them seem like embodiments of evil. When villagers said, "The king controls history," they did not realize that statement was the barest truth their era could produce. Thus, in a world where information was scarce, easily distorted, and controlled by a small group, while disease, war, and famine loomed constantly, conspiracies were not just entertainment on cold nights, but a way for people to try to understand the world. And the frightening thing is, the deeper we delve into forgotten layers of history, the more we realize an important truth. Medieval people were not entirely paranoid. They were simply trying to survive in an era where truth was harder to grasp than the shadow of one's own self. If you think royal impersonations were just a few isolated incidents, then remember that the Middle Ages were an era where merely wearing a fine hat, sitting tall on a horse, and not panicking at the sight of taxes was enough to make villagers believe you came from noble lineage. This created an extremely fertile market for those confident enough to say, "I am the king's son." No proof required, no medals needed. Just look more convincing than the guy who just walked out of the tavern. That chaos was not because they were foolish. On the contrary, it was because they were used to living in a world where truth was always partial, and information arrived too slowly, often slower than the plague. A king dies in the south, and it takes a whole month for the news to reach the north. In the meantime, at least 3 imposters managed to reach 3 different towns, each eagerly organizing a royal revival welcome ceremony. This makes you wonder, did Europeans at the time ever want to believe something crazy more than accepting a dull reality? But the truth is, many of those imposters actually had backgrounds peculiar enough that suspicion became a luxury. They knew court language. They knew royal rituals that the common folk had never heard of. A few knew how to behave at the dining table according to royal etiquette, a skill more valuable than gold when all of Europe ate as if fighting a loaf of bread. In other words, they had enough courtly material to confuse the populace. That is why royal conspiracies persisted across generations. When people were unsure whether the king was truly dead, they chose the more comforting path, believing he was hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return and correct all the world's mistakes. Part of them genuinely wanted to believe in such an administrative miracle. And here's the interesting part. These conspiracies thrived not because people were overly superstitious, but because kings sometimes really disappeared. Not in a magical way, but in a "I'm temporarily leaving the throne because everything here is too messy" kind of way. Medieval kings liked to play disappearing games so much that it almost became a royal ritual. Disappear for a few months to recover, change identities to test loyalty, or simply vanish to avoid signing new tax documents. So, when villagers said the king is still alive, sometimes it was not paranoia, it was a reasonable speculation in an era where news traveled by sleepy horse riders. But the strangest conspiracies did not stop at the royal family. Medieval Europe was also obsessed with those called omen tellers. These were wanderers claiming to read signs in the sky, understand the wind's voice, or see the future in streams. Regardless of their actual abilities, villagers treated them as a curious mix of prophet and talkative homeless person. This created a series of conspiracies about nomadic magical organizations controlling the kingdom's fate, even though in reality they were just trying to trade prophecy for a meal. However, there was a group that genuinely worried the authorities: folk astronomers, people who could predict rain, recognize full moon timing, know when the windy season would come, and worst of all, sometimes get it right. To ordinary people, they were a reservoir of useful information. But in the eyes of priests, they were dangerous rivals to the system where everything is decided by God. Thus, in any village with someone who could forecast weather better than the parish priest, a conspiracy immediately arose that the person was connected to wind spirits. And if crops failed, it was not the weather. It was because the weather forecaster had touched dark forces. In truth, these secret groups had no magic. They simply spent time observing nature daily instead of memorizing hymns. But that simple talent was enough to make them the main characters in fireside whispering stories. Yet, the peak of chaos and humor must be attributed to conspiracies about parallel villages. People believed there were secret communities living in forests, existing alongside the normal world, not elves or dwarves, but ordinary people fleeing taxes or family troubles. They lived in seclusion, occasionally appearing to trade goods or borrow a bucket, then disappearing again. Naturally, villagers concluded this was clear evidence of a mystical tribe. But the truth was much simpler. These were people simply tired of life and seeking peace. Still, not all conspiracies were humorous. Some contained frightening truths beneath the surface. Mercenary forces, night armies, noble spy groups all existed. They moved silently, gathered information, and interfered in politics. Villagers saw them and thought they were human ghosts. But in reality, they were just medieval agents with a budget smaller than a baptism ceremony. The unfortunate part was that the people, not understanding the true nature, always sought mystical explanations. And it was precisely the gap between truth and fear that nurtured astonishing conspiracies we today can both laugh at and shudder. Medieval people were not foolish. They were merely living in a world where truth rarely arrived in time, while fear was always at the door. And in that environment, any story, however absurd, could take root, as long as it made life slightly less confusing. In a world where identity could determine the fate of an entire dynasty, truth became a luxury, and rumor operated like a currency of power. In the Middle Ages, when war, plague, and politics made people distrust, even their own secret could become a plausible truth, and every plausibility was enough to ignite chaos. It is no wonder that all of Europe followed stories of imposters, mysterious figures, or lost bloodlines as if watching a long-running TV series, except that each episode here carried the risk of ending in actual war. Suspicion ran so high that the mere appearance of someone in an overly luxurious robe or someone who could read too fluently would immediately prompt villagers to whisper, "That is the lost heir." Ironically, sometimes they were right. In many crises, princes, princesses, and young nobles truly vanished from public view. They hid from assassination, avoided civil war, or simply evaded responsibilities they never wished to bear. And when they donned common clothes and mingled with the crowd, it was not a deception. It was a survival plan. In an era where every rumor had potential political benefit, claiming royal lineage was not only enticing but entirely plausible. From that precariousness, Europe developed a strange habit. When a powerful figure died under ambiguous circumstances, and the Middle Ages excelled at creating ambiguity more than any other era, people immediately suspected that the body was not theirs, or that the death was merely a staged act to escape enemies. At times, the entire continent resembled a stage for collective paranoid theater, where everyone saw the invisible hand of a conspiracy, even when it was anything but invisible. But if you want to find a place where conspiracies did not just exist as whispers, but were recorded, classified, protected, and stored in locked rooms, nowhere is more perfect than European monasteries. Amid the scent of incense and the steady chants, there existed rooms villagers called by all sorts of names: the cursed library, the warehouse of sins, or that place I dare not go, yet want to know what's inside. Those rooms were, in fact, secret archives where the church kept documents it did not want to leak. Not because they were cursed or possessed mystical power, but because they asked questions. Questions that bishops were uncomfortable answering. Some pagan manuscripts explained the lunar cycle with alarming precision. Some translations from the Islamic world described the human body in such detail that many priests blushed. Those books were not burned, simply because burning books caused chaos and drew attention. Instead, they were locked in rooms that only a few monks could enter. Those who understood that the key in their hands not only opened a wooden door, but also unleashed theological debates no one wished to start. However, if monasteries were the places that hid conspiracies, Italy was where conspiracy became an art. The magnificent city-states we know today were once power laboratories, where each closed door was a secret meeting, and each lavish feast was a prelude to a temporary alliance or a subtle betrayal. The rivalry between Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, and Siena was so intense that building a taller tower than a rival was not only symbolic, but a legitimate reason to start a war. Amid that chaos, Venice emerged as the center of all rumors, but the rumors were frighteningly accurate. The city established a spy system so complex that many modern nations would likely bow in respect. They had a secret council dedicated to receiving anonymous denunciation letters, a network of agents infiltrating Europe, and sophisticated financial monitoring that merchants of the time could hardly imagine. Reporting neighbors became a cultural pastime. Leaders of other states simultaneously traded with Venice and tried to avoid becoming the next target. Meanwhile, Florence operated its espionage network with the bottomless purse of the Medici family. Milan did what Milan did best: intimidation. Genoa sabotaged rivals with the subtlety of someone gently opening a door but accidentally extinguishing the candle. Siena, as always, feigned innocence to avoid accountability. The result was an underground war with all the elements of a complete movie plot: coded letters, cleverly disguised assassinations, accidentally broken treaties, and merchants disappearing without leaving a trace beyond an empty purse. Yet perhaps the most absurd truth of the Middle Ages lay in the belief in sacred bloodlines. The idea that a secret family carried royal or divine blood may sound fictional, but it was seriously believed across Europe. Nobles used genealogies to consolidate power, while the populace viewed every lost child, every literate beggar, and even every anonymous knight as a potential descendant of someone great. Medieval genealogies were unstable. Losses, wars, arranged marriages, and unnamed mysteries made them more like a labyrinth than a record. Therefore, someone secretly carrying royal blood was not merely a rumor. Sometimes it was deliberately nurtured by those involved. Ultimately, what made Middle Age conspiracies frighteningly real was not their complexity, but the context. A world lacking transparency, information, and trust, yet full of power. In such a reality, conspiracy was not an odd choice. It was almost a default way of life. In the warm darkness of the lantern-lit streets, amid swaying silk banners and the trill of stringed instruments, people suddenly became more honest with themselves. The burdens of feudal laws, the ridiculous taxes, the piled-up prohibitions, all seemed left behind outside the city's stone gates. For here, where the golden orange light touched the skin like an invitation, society operated by an entirely different set of rules. Rules written in passion, in curiosity, in the need to connect among people who were never allowed to speak their true desires. If most of Europe at night was a place where political conspiracies flowed quietly like an underground stream, Kyong was where the conspiracies of emotion blossomed, silently but so intensely that they shaped the lives of everyone who passed through. The street performers were the initiators. They played music as if every note were a whisper from drunken gods. A pipa player, her hair loosely tied with a red thread, plucked each sound like it sliced the water's surface. A young girl played the bamboo flute, each breath a thin wisp of smoke weaving into the listeners' minds. These sounds were not just music. They were introductions, signals, the opening curtain of the night ritual that Kiang preserved for generations, the ritual of liberation from oneself. From behind red eaves, the storytellers appeared. They sat on low wooden stools, a small bottle of cinnamon wine beside them, and began to weave tales no one could hear by day. Not about kings or wars. Everyone had already heard enough of that. They told of secret escapes in the night, vows in narrow alleys, encounters that happened only once and vanished like morning mist. They told of women hiding talents, men living double lives, children born between two worlds, and loves concealed behind small wooden fans. Each story was an escape. Each listener found a piece of their own life within it. But the true soul of Kiang did not lie on the stage or in the stories. It lay in the rooms behind the silk curtains, secret spaces where art, identity, and power intersected like small river branches. There, dancers powdered with rice flour and cinnabar rouge did more than perform. They exchanged information, they listened, they became the living memories of the entire neighborhood. Many merchants, officials, even elderly scholars came here to unburden fears, loneliness, and sometimes secrets so heavy that even the night felt weighed down. And so Kiang had its own conspiracies. But unlike deceitful political schemes, the plots here were strangely human. Street singers remembered suspicious journeys of merchants. Dancers knew precisely who was in danger, who needed to escape. Storytellers overheard the complaints of nobles about impending battles. And somehow, this information always found its way to the right person. Not to threaten, not to control, but to save. Some nights, a stranger would arrive with a tense expression, clutching the sleeves of their coat. A mere glance from the innkeepers was enough to know something was wrong. They did not ask. They merely guided the person to a room with a window facing the small canal, a secret exit known only to the people of Kiang. If the guest were a hunted merchant, they provided the way. If a debtor, they negotiated help. If fleeing violence, they offered shelter. None of this was written in any ledger, yet word of mouth spread faster than any royal decree. And like any place governed by emotion, Kiang had its law, the law of silence. What happened here never left. No names, no faces, no origins. For in this place, identity mattered less than the need to breathe freely, even for one night. This was why the monks in the nearby monastery, who often heard rumors about the Lantern District, were both curious and cautious. They whispered that Kiang was where people were too close to the truth, a remark half warning, half praise. What they did not know was that this very place had saved many from the nameless calamities of the Middle Ages. From families forced apart to scholars hunted for their thoughts, from scorned artists to common folk who only wanted a place to cry unseen. You could call it a conspiracy of the night, or a conspiracy of art. But in truth, Kiang was simply doing what very few places in the Middle Ages dared to do, creating a space where people could be themselves without asking permission. Like the secret networks of Jewish and Islamic communities, like Europe's underground economy, Kiang existed not to challenge power, but to help people survive it. The irony of history is that places like Kiang were always seen as shady, dangerous, even decadent, while they were the ones preserving the remnants of human kindness. In Kiang's luminous nights, the only real conspiracy was the conspiracy to preserve decency in a world too harsh to allow it by day. In the Flower Garden Pavilion, every movement had a purpose, every sound measured by an invisible gauge of art. The courtesans here did not live by noise or superficial charm. They lived by a subtlety that gradually seeped into every sense of those around them. Just stepping across the threshold, one could feel the change in the air, uh, as if the outside world had been left behind beyond the dark brown wood and delicate silk curtains. The trickling water in the koi pond flowed in a rhythmic stream, blending with footsteps as light as a breath. Plum blossoms were arranged in pale green porcelain vases, each petal seeming to tell its own story. A young courtesan practiced dance in the inner courtyard, her hands soft as if caressing the wind, red silk tied at her wrists creating vivid halos of color with every turn. Another sat by a stone table, grinding ink on an inkstone with movements so steady they became hypnotic. The scent of fresh ink filled the air, a smell both ancient and fresh, awakening the soul of anyone who had ever loved art. When her brush touched the paper, the strokes were not merely writing, but the very breaths of the room itself, graceful, serene, and full of nuance. Inside a larger room, guests were being received, not with loud greetings, but with knowing smiles and the faint sound of the Jeng-like sunlight falling on the floor. An older courtesan told an ancient story, her voice soft as velvet, enough to silence the room in attentive listening. No one interrupted, no one urged forward. Here, words were not for occupying space, but for guiding emotion. People came to the Flower Garden Pavilion not to demand attention, but to learn to listen to themselves through each narrative, each musical note, each cup of hot tea placed on the wooden table. And when the silk curtain was drawn aside, another world opened, a world of stories told not only with words, but with presence. Courtesans never entered a room hastily. They moved with the quiet confidence of those for whom art was part of their body. Every bow was measured by generations of tradition. Every smile contained multiple layers of emotion. Nothing was artificial in this elegance, for it was not a performance for an audience, but the ritual of a private world, where beauty was a language and subtlety a philosophy. It was often said that courtesans understood people better than any scholar or official, for they saw what no one dared speak. They listened to the anxieties of a young scholar, the familial worries of an elderly merchant, the awkward confessions of a soldier weary of the battlefield, and, remarkably, they never judged. The world was full of laws, but within the walls of the Flower Garden Pavilion, one could be honest without fear of scorn. This was the rarest luxury of the Middle Ages, to be a little weak, a little fragile, without contempt. This empathy also created another kind of power, gentle as a thread, yet strong enough to change the fate of those who visited. A famous courtesan could alter an official's thinking with a single word of advice over tea. Another artist could inspire a scholar to abandon feudal disputes and return to poetry. At times, courtesans even used their network to warn people of impending upheavals in the court, stories shared in whispers but never written down. They were not politicians, yet they possessed a soft power that hard authority could never reach. As night fell, the Flower Garden Pavilion became even more radiant. Red lanterns were hung high, their light reflecting off rose quartz-colored curtains, creating a sky shimmering like dewdrops on gems. In the main hall, a small performance began. No stage, no fixed seats. Each guest sat on a pastel silk cushion, close enough to see the golden threads on the performer's robe. A courtesan stepped forward, holding a wooden fan, opening it with a movement so smooth it seemed the wind itself performed the gesture. The jang sounded from the corner of the room like water flowing over pebbles, and then she began to recite poetry. Her voice was not loud, but clear enough for the audience to feel as if hearing unspoken thoughts. The verses spoke of impermanence, of human loneliness, of the desire to see and to be understood, things every guest carried in their hearts but seldom voiced. No one applauded. No one needed to express appreciation aloud. Reverent silence was the way they showed gratitude. For in those moments, the courtesans did not merely perform, they held a mirror to each person's heart, letting them see what they had forgotten or deliberately denied. When the poem ended, only the gentle wind stirred the lanterns. One guest exhaled softly as if shedding part of a burden. Another reached for a cooled cup of tea. Each person in their own way returned to themselves. And that was the greatest magic of the Flower Garden Pavilion. Not its luxury or craftsmanship, but its ability to make people feel safe enough to be honest. A place where beauty was not only to be observed, but to heal. A place where a cup of tea, a poem, a glance could soothe years of storms. In the heart of Kifeng's floating world, among the lights and the rhythm of nighttime drums, the courtesans preserved the softest part of human nature, a part the harsh world outside would never allow to exist. Music has always been the invisible thread connecting people from different worlds, and in the hidden gardens of Kiang, it transforms into a ritual that purifies the soul. When the first notes sound, all the stories outside, political struggles, tense examinations, solitary journeys, seem to slip off the listener's shoulders. Strangely, no one commands silence. It comes naturally, as if stepping into a temple where the heart instinctively knows how to calm. Talented courtesans understand that music is not merely something to perform. It is a means to connect, to soothe, to guide even the most exhausted spirits back to the softness eroded by the world. Often an evening begins with the clear tones of the peeper, a small pear-shaped instrument, compact yet full of expression. Just 2 or 3 melodies, and the atmosphere seems to breathe with a different warmth. Lanterns suddenly shine brighter. The night breeze becomes gentler. Guests, still sitting upright out of courtesy, gradually relax their shoulders. The courtesans, moving with steps light as silk, glide through the halls and gardens as if they belong to this space more than anyone else. When they pluck the strings, every movement is like a stroke of calligraphy in the air, delicate, intentional, and contemplative. If the peeper is the soft laughter of the evening, then the guqin is the deep sigh of the night. Its low vibrations pull listeners into memories they didn't know they had forgotten. Damp village roads after an early summer rain, sunsets at the foot of a mountain, or the feeling of sitting quietly in a silent room as autumn first arrives. The sound tells no clear story, yet evokes an entire world. The courtesan playing does not use only their hands, they use their breath, heartbeat, and empathy honed over decades. The audience does not merely listen to music, but enters a state of recollection they never anticipated. Some shed tears, not from sadness, but because they find something gentler than grief: release. Then comes the moment when the bamboo flute slips into the background like a thin breeze gliding over a still pond. The flute never seeks to dominate the performance. It merely whispers, suggests, sometimes no more than a faint breath passing by. Yet it is this humility that makes it the soul of the night. Visitors often say that when the flute sounds, they feel as if standing in a garden of night blooming flowers. Not dazzling, not ostentatious, yet so beautiful it makes the heart pause for a beat. Music is only part of the vast panorama of Kiang's floating world. Talented courtesans are not only artists, but keepers of humanity's silent stories. In long conversations under lantern light, they learn to listen more than they speak, ask questions at the right moments, and touch the hearts of those accustomed to having to be strong. A scholar who has just failed an exam is inspired not by empty advice, but by patience and a listening gaze. A pressured official finds a place where they are not a figure of power, but a weary human being. Wandering travelers from afar often leave feeling as if they have just found a homeland they never knew. In the quiet spaces of the hidden gardens, calligraphy exerts its power. A courtesan may give a guest a fresh scroll, place an inkstone beside it, and invite them to write a single character expressing their mood. Those who believe they knew nothing of calligraphy are surprised when their hand trembles with emotion. Here, writing is not for beauty, it is for self-understanding. Many officials later admitted that the characters they wrote that night, crooked or vague as they were, saved them from making wrong decisions when returning to the world of politics. Tea ceremony cannot be overlooked, a silent ritual practiced by courtesans with as much reverence as professional artisans. A small teacup is placed on a lacquered table, a thin wisp of steam rises, and every pouring motion is executed with mindfulness. Tea is not for drinking, but to bring the mind back to the present. And in that moment, when a guest lifts the cup, inhales the mingling scent of tea leaves and night air, they realize that the world can slow down, and they have the right to slow down as well. The tranquility of the gardens, the gentle music of the night, the non-judgmental listening of the courtesans, all combine into what visitors always describe with the same word: peace. Peace not because they are indulged, but because for a moment they are seen as their true selves, not the roles they bear. And that is why these memories stay with them for life, not because of the beauty of the lanterns or the music, but because in Kiang, amid the night's subtlety, they encountered something that seems rare in life: tenderness for the soul. In the first moments of dawn, when Kiang sinks into silence and the fleeting world dissolves into thin mist, it is easy to forget that beyond the city walls, human history has once trembled under far more violent shocks. Where Kiang immerses itself in tea, calligraphy, and music, thousands of years and countless miles away, a colossal machine moves silently forward: the army of Alexander the Great. No lanterns guide their way, no guqin lifts their spirits. The only thing covering the night sky is the infinity of desert, rock, and lands unnamed. Yet they march on, persistent as a flood-swollen river, unstoppable in its course. Whenever people speak of Alexander, they speak of tactical genius, courage, and military breakthroughs that struck fear into the ancient world. But there is a lesser-told story: the story of wooden wheels, sacks of hardtack, pack mules, and the silent people who followed behind the army. If Kiang exists through art and emotion, Alexander's empire exists through every grain of wheat, every pair of leather sandals repaired in time, every barrel of water transported across dozens of barren miles. Logistics is not the beauty of Kiang, but it is the quiet beauty of campaigns that rewrote the map of the world. From the moment he left Macedonia, Alexander led a structure that modern historians describe as a walking city. Nearly 40,000 people, including not only soldiers but also blacksmiths, doctors, scribes, interpreters, engineers, siege workers, even animal handlers and cooks. Viewed from a high hill, the army resembles a massive yet orderly flow, a moving carpet woven of metal, wood, animals, and sweat. No modern machines assist, no satellite maps, no radio. Yet the army moves with such precision that even modern forces admire it. The secret to this feat lies not only in the strength of the soldiers, but in the philosophy Alexander inherited and improved from his father: Philip II. Move lightly, operate swiftly. No cumbersome wagons like the Persian army, no bulky supply carts vulnerable to ambush, no countless servitors trailing behind. The Macedonian army carried less than expected, yet produced more than they possessed. They survived on organization, not luxury. His warriors carried only the essentials: a shield, a long spear, some barley bread, lighter armor than the standard of the time, and most importantly, training to survive any terrain. The rest was transported by thousands of mules and camels, resilient creatures forming the backbone of the mobile empire. Each animal carried not just supplies, but the future of the campaign. What made this system work was not brute strength, but calculations so precise it bordered on art. Just as a courtesan grinds ink until its scent fills the room, the logistics commander had to calculate exactly how much wheat would be consumed, how much water transported across the desert, how many sandals would wear out before reaching the next border. A single miscalculation could leave the entire army starving in unfamiliar lands. And then, like small groups in Kiang, improvising together, Alexander's logistics had to adapt constantly. Sometimes they encountered fertile lands, full of food, and the army was revitalized. Sometimes they faced scorching deserts, distributing every sip of water as if it were the soul of the entire force. Every decision was a beat in the symphony of survival that lasted years. Engineers went ahead, surveying terrain, building temporary bridges from raw logs, clearing the way for tens of thousands to cross rivers. Blacksmiths set up forges in the fields, repairing every spear tip, every piece of armor. Bakers ground grain on stones to provide breakfast the next morning. Each person was a brushstroke in the vast logistical painting, a painting never hung on a wall, yet the foundation of an entire empire. At times, the army trudged through snow-covered mountains, iron helmets blanketed in frost. At other times, they crossed muddy plains, soil clinging to boots like stone. And each time, the logistical system adapted as if it had a soul. That is the difference between Kiang and the battlefield. In Kiang, art soothes the human spirit. In Alexander's army, art keeps humans alive. In the end, it is easy to call Alexander a tactical genius, but the more one understands his logistics, the clearer it becomes that his victories were not built solely on blood and strategy, but on a finely tuned structure bordering on poetry. A poetry not written on paper, but written with sweat, dust, and footsteps that never cease. If marching is the heartbeat, then logistics is the breath of the entire Macedonian army. Every step, every advance forward is measured not only by swords or spears, but by food, water, livestock, and intelligence. Alexander understood that the survival of 40,000 people could not depend on courage alone. They needed food for muscles to move, water for minds to stay sharp, and neat hair on their heads to feel human amidst vast deserts or rugged mountain passes. It was not merely an army, but a living machine, operated with intellect, careful observation, and foresight like a master artist preparing the final painting. As dawn broke, the legion was ready. But ahead lay not only open plains or high passes, there was the harshness of terrain, the scorching heat of the desert, and the threat of water scarcity, an invisible enemy, yet far deadlier than any foe. Days before, scouting cavalry had silently marched in advance, sometimes covering 50 kilometers per day, mapping every river, well, sand dune, and settlement. They observed livestock in settled areas, monitored any signs of enemy forces, and recorded the position of every tree and rock. Each report was a prophecy, accurate and it could save a unit, flawed and it could doom thousands. When they reported, Alexander did not merely read the information. He envisioned the entire column, the wagons, the herds following behind. He calculated time, distance, speed, and food consumption, like a conductor controlling an entire orchestra. 1 kilogram of wheat per person per day might sound simple, but multiplied by tens of thousands, plus horses, mules, sheep, and oxen, it became a colossal calculation only the most organized minds could manage. Each collection, each transport was meticulously planned. Not too much to slow the army, not too little to cause shortages, and always flexible enough to adapt to any contingencies along the route. In barren lands where deserts stretched without a tree in sight, Alexander had to innovate. He used livestock not only as food, but as transport, like a living network connecting units. Fresh food, milk, hides, and sometimes tents traveled on 4 legs, grazing the barren earth under human feet. Water became liquid gold, wells were marked, underground streams remembered, and scouts went ahead not only to map but to ensure that each army would have enough water to survive. A small miscalculation or false information from a coerced guide could cost thousands their lives, not by sword, but by thirst or starvation. In Asia Minor, Alexander leveraged local cooperation. Greek cities opened their doors to his army, providing provisions and guidance. In Syria and Mesopotamia, traveling merchants familiar with wells and routes acted as silent advisors. In Bactria and Sogdia, he turned captured tribal leaders into voluntary guides by granting status, wealth, and clemency. Alexander understood that a coerced guide will only take you where you want to go, while a willing guide will lead you where you need to go. This subtlety, seemingly minor, determined the success or failure of an entire campaign. On treacherous mountains, like the Hindu Kush, the army had to move in single file. Snow-covered boots, spears cracked under the harsh cold, yet every plan was calculated. Broken paths temporarily filled with stones, rations distributed to struggling units, livestock divided so that no animal fell before reaching its destination. Deserts were even harsher. The plains of Syria, Mesopotamia, the Gedrosian Desert, every step depended on precise prior information. Local guides interrogated scouts, and merchants provided details about wells, shaded paths, and temporary shelters. Even a small mistake could kill thousands. Yet Alexander turned these challenges into opportunities. He used terrain like a seasoned sailor uses wind. Every hill and river was not just an obstacle, but an ally. Army units moved flexibly, cavalry protected supply columns, engineers leveled ground, laid planks over mud, and built temporary bridges if necessary. When rivers were too wide, he utilized rafts, boats, or captured vessels. Each crossing was a military construction, each journey a small campaign within the grand campaign. Movement was not just transport, it was strategy. Mastering terrain meant mastering time, striking before the enemy could react, and keeping his troops strong. No campaign survives on swords or courage alone. Armies blind to information perish in the desert, fall into ambush, or starve. Alexander understood this better than anyone. The logistics system, scouts, guides, interpreters, and local cooperation formed the living nervous system of this vast machine. Every step, every meal, every drop of water was controlled like brushstrokes in a grand painting. Only when these seemingly silent elements operated smoothly did legendary battles, glorious victories, and bold decisions become possible. Logistics was not merely a silent support element, but the rhythm shaping every campaign of Alexander. Every step, every siege, every river crossing or fortress conquest was orchestrated like a massive symphony with scouts, engineers, doctors, carpenters, and soldiers as the notes, blending together to create a perfect war symphony. Without detailed information about water sources or grain stores, without the preparation of engineers and sappers, any victory would have been mere chance. Alexander understood that true victory began with logistics, where every person, every horse, every sack of grain played a role as important as the warriors on the battlefield. Interpreters were vital links in this network. They were fluent in Persian, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of local dialects. Thanks to them, Alexander knew which granaries were full, which wells were deep enough, and which paths were safe for the army to traverse. Even a shepherd or a child who knew the location of a hidden spring could determine the survival of an entire unit. And Alexander himself, with innate curiosity and questioning skill, personally engaged in this process. He asked, listened, observed, turning scattered information into a predictable strategy. Thus, diplomacy and logistics became powerful weapons, nearly as effective as spears or bows. Before any fortress, Alexander did not rush in. He prepared, constructed, calculated, and controlled every step. Engineers and carpenters advanced, carrying axes, ropes, timber, and tools, transforming the army into a living construction force. Every siege tower, tunnel, and catapult was meticulously planned, based on analysis of walls, trajectory calculations, and identification of weak points. Wood, materials, grain, and other supplies were transported from miles away, carefully stored in temporary depots, and circulated to the front lines. These constructions turned each siege into a massive logistical campaign where organizational skill was as crucial as battlefield tactics. Grain and water became the center of all activity. During sieges, when the army stood still, consumption rose but supplies dwindled. and the threat of starvation and disease always loomed. Alexander addressed this by preparing supply lines in advance, cooperating with surrounding villages and towns to maintain provisions. Even during continuous combat, he did not let his army suffer shortages, knowing that a single day without water or grain could break discipline and morale. Alexander's victories across rivers exemplify the combination of engineering and logistics. Each crossing, from the Granicus, Tigris, Euphrates to the Indus, was not only a marvel of military coordination, but also a colossal technical problem. Scouts measured depth, current speed, and identified safe banks. Engineers calculated temporary rafts, ferries, boats, or floating platforms for horses, artillery, and grain. Sometimes he used psychological tactics, crossing at night against the current, or creating diversions to mislead the enemy. Each campaign demonstrated that intelligent logistics could turn nature into an ally rather than an enemy. Not only water, but the morale and health of the troops were part of the logistical plan. Alexander maintained medical teams with doctors, herbalists, and surgeons accompanying the army. They carried bronze and iron surgical tools, bandages, splints, and medicinal herbs. Every injury, every illness, every exhausted soldier was treated, ensuring that bodies and minds were in peak condition for combat. An exhausted or sick army could neither march nor fight, no matter how perfect the strategy. Alexander also managed supply lines by sea. When controlling Phoenician ports, he built transport fleets carrying grain, siege equipment, spare weapons, and even horses. These fleets turned rivers and seas from obstacles into vast highways. Escort vessels moved in tight formations, coordinating seamlessly with infantry, creating a perfect floating transport machine. Each sea voyage, each day waiting for calm waters or overcoming storms, was proof of Alexander's meticulousness, patience, and genius foresight. Victory did not come solely from swords or spears, but from the perfect logistics system: information, food, water, siege engineering, medical care, and the ability to anticipate nature. Alexander triumphed not just through tactics or courage, but through intellect, organization, and a logistical vision that encompassed the entire campaign. His army moved, fought, and survived through strength, through provisions, and through silent efforts few recognized. And it was these seemingly invisible elements that forged the invincible legend history still recounts. The morale of the army was the most precious resource Alexander ever possessed, yet also the most vulnerable. Logistics did not stop at food, water, or siege equipment. It extended to maintaining physical health, mental well-being, and the cohesion of people far from home, fighting under scorching suns, storms, and desolate plains. Alexander understood that even the mightiest army would collapse if faith in leadership and mutual care was lost. For this reason, he placed medical care and safety on equal footing with tactics. Doctors and herbalists always accompanied each unit, setting up mobile field hospitals near the front lines, ready to treat wounds, infections, or illnesses. Medical care was not merely a life-saving act. It was part of a war culture Alexander built, where the wounded were respected, their honor and lives prioritized above all. This respect saved countless lives and maintained the belief that everyone in the army was important and no one would be abandoned. Water ranked second only to blood in the importance of logistics. A contaminated well could kill an entire battalion in days, and Alexander never allowed this to happen. Scouts checked water sources before soldiers drank. If water was unsafe, they boiled it, filtered it through cloth, or mixed it with alcohol to purify it. In the desert, where the heat scorched the skin, every drop of water became as valuable as gold. Alexander was known for pouring water into his own helmet before his soldiers as a message: "I will not drink what you are denied." These seemingly small actions instilled faith and willpower in the army more than any speech could. In Alexander's eyes, troop morale was an invisible yet powerful logistical resource. Those who trusted the goal and their leader would endure hardship, march farther, fight longer, and complain less. To maintain this resource, he employed psychological and social measures. Alexander fought alongside his troops, ate with them, and publicly honored the fallen. After each victory, he organized games, feasts, and religious ceremonies, reminding the army that their pain and effort had meaning. Rotating units, allowing rest and equipment repair, became another silent logistical tool. In winter, he paused major campaigns, sheltering troops in fertile, well-provisioned, and warm regions. These breaks preserved physical strength and reduced the risk of exhaustion, heat stroke, frostbite, or disease, silent killers many commanders of the past overlooked. Alexander also understood that a large army stretching for dozens of miles could only be effective if communication flowed uninterrupted. Before radios or swift official dispatches, he built a system of messengers on horseback, trained to traverse rugged terrain at high speed, carrying orders from him to commanders, from commanders to officers, and from officers to soldiers. Horses were stationed along the march route, ready for any emergency. A message could travel dozens of kilometers per day, allowing the entire unit to respond in hours rather than days. Thus, even troops marching out of Alexander's sight operated as a unified entity. Within the formation, the army moved in strict organization: heavy infantry, cavalry, light infantry, engineers, and transport convoys. Officers used drums, horns, and signals to maintain pace, distance, and formation. A minor change could affect hundreds of people, but thanks to rigorous training, every maneuver occurred smoothly, even on narrow paths or treacherous hills. Before major battles, Alexander convened councils with generals, explaining the terrain, assigning duties, and listening to proposals. This transparency and coordination helped soldiers understand objectives, maintain trust, and obey orders, even when hours away from direct supervision. The logistical system extended beyond the army to the conquered regions. Envoys, diplomats, and local intelligence networks provided information and support. Even during rapid assaults, these administrative structures maintained supplies, order, and loyalty. When the army needed to pivot, scouts went ahead, like supply convoys adjusted routes, engineers altered tasks, and soldiers reorganized formations, all smoothly coordinated through accurate communication. Without this synchronization, the army could disintegrate instantly. However, in the final years of the campaign, Alexander began to face logistical limits. In India and the Gedrosian Desert, monsoon rains turned roads into rivers, grain rotted, and wagons sank deep in mud. Water became scarce, and heat killed faster than any sword. Even veteran generals admitted they had never seen such harsh terrain. Army morale began to decline. Nevertheless, the system held long enough to save most of the forces from total disaster. Scouts located water, surviving coastal supply fleets delivered provisions, officers maintained order and morale. Alexander shared the suffering, refused special treatment, and sustained trust and cohesion. Ultimately, the lesson became clear. Logistics was not merely about transporting supplies or maintaining troop numbers. It was the foundation of every victory, the ultimate limit that nature, terrain, and time could impose on an army. Alexander elevated logistics to an art form, combining planning, discipline, technology, and morale, turning even the harshest lands into battlefields that humans could survive. And it was this seamless unity, not swords, that created enduring greatness in his campaigns, paving the way for the legend of Alexander the Great that history still recounts. Sabura was not a place for the faint of heart, nor did it tolerate hesitation. When night fell, the district transformed into a living entity, a maze of flickering lights and intertwined shadows. The wavering glow of oil lamps in taverns cast shadows along winding alleys and rickety staircases. The smells of burning oil, stewed fish, stale wine, and sweat mingled together, making every breath a sensory experience, leaving travelers unable to distinguish the scent of food from the scent of sin. But for the residents of Sabura, these aromas were signs of life, the heartbeat of the district, proof that it was always in motion despite the chaos. The nighttime tavern became a center of energy where streams of information and intrigue flowed from the working class to the powerful. Outside, drunken men staggered, sometimes fighting over a careless word. Inside, merchants whispered about shady deals, soldiers boasted of upcoming campaigns, and political henchmen discreetly passed bribes. Every story, every word, no matter how small, was remembered. The tavern owners, maidens, and even prostitutes became the eyes and ears of Sabura, where information traveled faster than any path to the Senate. Nothing in Sabura was accidental. Everything was observed, every action had consequences, and those who knew how to listen held invisible power. Criminal gangs were an indispensable part of this survival structure. They operated openly, weaving through crowds, hiding on rooftops, or slipping through broken windows. Skilled pickpockets relied not only on muscle but also on an understanding of human flow, creating just enough distraction to act. Sabura's children learned the trade early, playing while learning survival. They ran through narrow alleys, slipping wallets, tugging belts, or teasing as part of a game. Vice was taught, but it was also a means to survive in this world. Large and small gangs controlled different areas, from brothel protection rings and gambling houses to streets where small shops profited from clever schemes. The bonds between gangs were not of friendship but of profit. Power and money were the ties that bound members together. However, Sabura was not only crime and chaos, it was also where small dreams persisted. Prostitutes, despite danger, managed their work strategically, knowing how to earn a living and protect themselves. Some were slaves, but many had chosen their occupation freely, seeking to earn more than typical laborers. Others were fugitives, escapees, or the abandoned, finding this place to survive. Sabura became a cultural crossroads. Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, Gaul, every corner of the empire left its mark. Languages blended, voices intertwined, and desires, despair, and schemes formed a rich survival network. The operation of Sabura resembled an underground economy. Each person had a role and value. Taverns were information markets, where customers, prostitutes, and madams interacted to exchange news, assess prices, or coordinate actions. In a single evening, a rumor could spread throughout the district, affecting everyone from guards to wealthy merchants. Even the richest brothel was only one link in this vast network, where every action, every word was carefully considered. The diversity of these establishments, from simple rooms to multi-chamber houses with mosaic interiors and perfumes, reflected both luxury and risk. Whether lavish or modest, they carried the essence of Sabura, always noisy, dangerous, and alluring. At night, Sabura donned its most brutal face. Crime did not hide, it moved openly, claiming streets and rooftops, practicing its trade as an essential part of life's rhythm. Theft, protection rackets, and gangs of varying size and power created an ecosystem full of risk but effective. Even the city police had to exercise caution, often avoiding direct confrontation, intervening only when outnumbered or when stakes were high. Residents and those surviving off Sabura adapted. Even when fights broke out, the crowd knew how to scatter, troublemakers were restrained, and everything quickly returned to normal as part of the district's inherent rhythm. Yet it was in Sabura that Rome's rawest values were exposed. This was where the working class laughed, cried, bled, and schemed, where cunning, survival, and ambition intertwined. Sabura was not merely a poor district, a hub of crime, or a brothel area. It was the living heart of the city, where any news, rumor, or decision could spread like veins flowing throughout the empire. It was the underground economic, social, and cultural center, where people learned to live in chaos while maintaining their rhythm of life. Sabura existed for a clear reason. Despite its bustle, danger, and vice, it maintained Rome's heartbeat, keeping the working class, gossip, and information flowing continuously. It was the connecting hub between power and common life, where life, death, and desire walked hand in hand. At night, Sabura did not sink into darkness. It blazed, dangerous and full of vitality, a testament that chaos has its own order, and that the rawest parts of Rome formed the foundation for the survival of the entire empire. Subura at night was not only a place where criminals and laborers jostled to survive, it was also a continuous stage of chaos and opportunity, where every action was observed and evaluated. As the sun set, the towering insula buildings transformed into a dark labyrinth, narrow spiral staircases like wooden snakes, and dimly lit hallways flickering with oil lamp light with every step. Darkness became a curtain for all activity. Thieves crept along rooftops, slipped through narrow windows, or navigated secret passageways known only to Subura's residents. Wanderers, from children learning pickpocketing to experienced thieves, all knew how to turn the night into an ally. Every step was a gamble. One mistake, one misplaced glance, and they could be knocked down, caught stealing, or worse, pursued by a rival gang. The people of Subura not only lived with the threat of crime, but also endured pressure from territorial gangs. Some groups operated as unofficial police, protecting residents and maintaining order in exchange for rent or services. But not all were well-intentioned. Violence, betrayal, and territorial disputes were commonplace. Fights could erupt suddenly, daggers flashing in the hands of those vying for power, forcing passersby to flee. In the maze of alleys, anything could happen, from minor collisions to life and death battles. For those living here, reading signs, faces, and gestures became a survival skill. Darkness was not to hide crime, but to test the alertness and acuity of the residents. Yet, Subura was not only violence and crime, it was the silent heart of Rome where workers, craftsmen, and honest laborers kept the empire running. Each morning before the taverns opened, the clatter of carts, bricks hitting the floor, and hammers striking anvils echoed through the streets. Porters moved swiftly, carrying sacks of grain, barrels of fish, wine, and clay pots to markets and warehouses. Builders, carpenters, potters, and metalworkers began their workdays under the scorching sun, sweat beading their foreheads, hands gripping mallets, chisels, and saws, every movement aimed at maintaining Rome's infrastructure. Meanwhile, women labored washing clothes, grinding grain, and cooking to provide food for families or for sale in the markets, ensuring the survival of the community. Children had no time for carefree play. They learned trades early, helped their families, and gradually acquired survival skills in the district. The taverns and street markets of Subura were the district's second heartbeat. They were not just places for exchanging food and goods. They were information hubs where every rumor, transaction, and scheme spread rapidly. Vendors, from fishmongers and greengrocers to bakers, sold while listening for news. In narrow hallways, from calls to attract customers to quarrels to giggles, every sound was part of a living information network. Within this space, a scandal in a wealthy family, a gladiator who dodged a match, or a failing politician quickly became hot gossip, spreading through taverns and market stalls alike. Every morning at dawn, Subura still bore the remnants of the long night: dim oil lamps, brothel doors slammed shut, and the weary smiles of prostitutes who not only worked but also collected and disseminated information. The Insula building still stood, leaning under the weight of hundreds of residents, their narrow and rough spiral staircases making movement an art of survival. Each tiny apartment, with a straw mattress and a few simple belongings, was its own world, where families battled hunger, disease, and strived to maintain life in cramped and dangerous spaces. Fires were a constant fear for Subura's residents. Insulae built from cheap wood and dry plaster could turn any spark into a life-threatening danger. A toppled brazier or a fallen oil lamp could engulf an entire building in flames within minutes. When fire broke out, thick smoke spread through the narrow streets. Neighbors helped each other, pulling children and the elderly from the blaze, and fought the fire with whatever they had. Each fire was a test of survival skills, solidarity, and improvisational ability. Although Subura was a place of crime, poverty, and compounded danger, it survived through resilience, intelligence, and community spirit. Residents learned to adapt, protect one another, share food, care for children, and support the sick. Here, Rome's vitality was sustained. The smoke-filled streets, the noise, the mingling scents, the quarrels, collisions, and even gossip were all essential parts of Subura's rhythm. Nowhere else in Rome reflected the vivid, harsh, and heroic life of the working class as truthfully as Subura. It was a living body where crime and labor, danger and information, survival and culture all merged into a relentless pulse, allowing Rome not just to exist but to operate effectively amid chaos and order. Subura was not merely a district, it was a living experience. Every alley, staircase, tavern, market, and insula told a story of survival, skill, and endurance. It taught residents, visitors, and observers a simple yet harsh truth. In Subura, alertness, unity, and adaptability were the keys to survival. These chaotic streets, the leaning rooftops, the towering insula buildings, and the network of overt crime were all proof of a Rome that thrived through the labor and survival of Subura. If Rome was a mighty empire, Subura was the moving machinery within, operating on the sweat, blood, and stories of thousands of residents, where every danger became part of daily life and every challenge forged resilience to the bone. Here, amidst chaos, disorder, and piercing noise, Subura endured, alive and indomitable. It was the center not only for what was visible on the surface, but also where every story, secret, opportunity, and threat converged. Subura taught that amidst danger and crime, poverty and violence, the strongest life force still persisted, the one that any empire had to rely upon. This was where Rome breathed, pulsed, and survived.